Hey everyone, I'm India, the product specialist for Demonstrated Success, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar on teaching words and context across disciplines. We're happy to have you with us today. I'd like to introduce Karen Matzo, our Director of Professional Development and Literary Curriculum. She's your presenter today. I'm here to answer your questions as Karen moves through the presentation. Before we start, I'd like to draw your attention to the control panel so you know how to ask questions and get handouts in our polls. First, everyone on the webinar is on mute to avoid interrupting, but if you have any questions, please type it in and I will stop Karen and she will answer your question. Also, there are handouts attached to the handout section at the bottom of the control panel. At the end of the webinar, if you want to stay on and ask any final questions, we'll unmute and we'll chat. Also, the webinar is recorded and it will be posted on our Demonstrated Success resource website. I have noticed that we have one listener with their hand up. If you like to type in your question, I can make sure that I get back to you as Karen starts, okay? All right, Karen, it's all yours.
Hi, everybody. So yeah, like India said, on your control panel, there is a place to type in questions, and I will answer them throughout. I'm happy to be interrupted. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, India, for the introduction and for fielding questions. As India said, we record all our webinars and they are posted on our resource site under the DS Professional Development Resources. So you can see at the bottom of this slide where it says webinars, and that is where this webinar will be, probably at the end of the day, latest tomorrow. I do want to show you in the handout section, there's a bunch of resources there for you. In addition, there's also a certificate for attendance for the webinar. That's the very first one that's uploaded, so don't forget to grab that. And then there's just some instructional resources for you that I can refer to as we progress in the webinar. Okay, so it's going to be really straightforward today, right? Why are we thinking about words in context and vocabulary across disciplines? Why is it important? And then I'm going to talk to you about some instructional strategies to support that in, across all disciplines: math, social studies, science, technology, health. I will give you a heads up that the content today will be decidedly focused 6 through 12. So if you are here from an elementary school, you will have to modify or can think about modifying some of it. There will be plenty here for you in terms of resources that you can also use. But I'm talking probably some of the language I'm using is 6 through 12. Okay. So here's a reason to focus on words in context and vocabulary. It's in your standards, right? So along with the ELA Common Core standards, there are also reading standards and writing standards for social studies and science and technical subjects. And there's writing standards that we can see underneath. So we're going to talk a little bit about those. And in order to fulfill your commitment to the standards, right, then we should be teaching reading and writing in the content areas. So just to show you, I'm going to try to hone in on words in context and vocabulary today, but it really is closely associated with complex texts and close reading. So just to show you some of the standards that are relevant for words in context and vocabulary teaching, right? So in the Common Core, New Hampshire Common College and Career Readiness standards, one of the social studies standards you can see right here has to do with determining the meaning of words and phrases as they are used in a text, and analyzing how the author uses and refines the meaning of key terms over the course of a text. And then for science and science and technical subjects, there is a standard that explicitly speaks to helping students determine the meaning of symbols, key terms, and domain-specific words and phrases in science and technical content. So there's disciplinary reading standards, and over here we have the discipline area writing standards that explicitly say we are to support students as they learn to use precise language, domain-specific vocabulary, and take techniques, right? All the sorts of literary techniques, okay? I just wanted to bring up the science practices a little bit and the social studies standards, the C3. So there's a lot of focus on language use and communication in the science practices and in the next gen standards and also in the C3 standards. At the bottom, we have obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information, right? And number 7, engaging in argument from evidence. And even number 6, right, constructing explanations. So we are asked to use a lot of language-based thinking, explaining, drawing conclusions. And so that supports this idea that we need to help our students to be critical consumers of text, and they also need to be facile with using language effectively when they're trying to explain themselves. And in social studies, if you look at dimension 4, right, communicating conclusions and taking informed action. Communicating and critiquing conclusions. Again, this asks us to help our students to be able to use specific word choice, to be targeted in their communication, and that a lot of that goes back to vocabulary and getting comfortable with making sense of complex texts and then also using your own language in a targeted way. Whoops. I did want to point out that the language standards also from the Common Core or New Hampshire College and Career Readiness standards emphasize the use of vocabulary and the effective use of language. So I just listed 4 here that are very relevant. Speaking to how language functions in different contexts, the ability to clarify the meaning of unknown words and multiple meanings, working with figurative language, relationships between words, and a general range of academic and domain-specific words and phrases, right? So these are our obligations if we are aligned to the Common Core standards in our courses. I also want to talk about for high school, because the origin of this webinar was work that I did at a couple of high schools last year in particular. We have done a lot of analyzing SAT data in the last couple of years through our data initiative and through work in schools. And words in context is one of the subcategories in both the reading and the writing and language section of the SAT. And it's highly emphasized, and many of the schools that I worked with, or several of the schools whose data I worked with, were weak in words in context. And it's a big part of the assessment. So it just to show you here, 18 items inform that words in context score. And the SAT, unlike when we were younger, right? Gone are the days where you're memorizing obscure words that really, unless you're in a highly academic environment, you're never going to use again, unless you want to be annoying to your friends and your family. But those days are gone, right? Nobody's memorizing vocabulary anymore, and there's not an SAT tutor in the world worth their weight that's emphasizing that. Instead, the SAT really is emphasizing something that they call high utility words, okay? And those are words and phrases that appear in college courses and in professional texts. And we're going to talk more about that now. I'm going to show you some items from the SAT. So in the reading section, that words in context, those questions require students to use context clues to figure out the meaning of a word or phrase. And usually, oftentimes, the word that they're trying to discern is a word that they are familiar with in a different context. So it could be a word like refrain, right? That has a musical context, right? But it also has a non-musical context around repeating, right? So that's one purpose of the questions. Another one is that the questions ask the student to decide how an author's word choice affects the overall meaning and the style and the tone of a passage. So those are sort of the two types of questions in the reading section. And then in the writing section, the students are asked to alter word choice to make it better, to improve it, to make it more targeted so that it agrees with the tone or the message of the passage or the syntax of the passage. Okay. So I'm about to show you a specific question from the writing and language test, right? And this just sort of repeats some of what I was saying before, but they'll give you an opportunity to make wordy language more concise and precise, or to choose a different word that maintains style or tone. Don't forget to ask questions. I've become aware that I'm talking very quickly, so stop me if you have questions. So here's a sample item from the SAT. This one is focused in the writing section, and it's a sample of choosing the best word. And there's a sentence here from a part of a longer passage, and they ask the students, so I'm just going to read it. The cats are so cherished by the museum that officials recently decreed original paintings to be made of 6 of them. In each, a cat is depicted upright, blah, 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 blah. So this is a example of where a student is asked to either make no change or to substitute a better word for the word decreed, right? So if you all want to be participatory here, in the question box in your control panel, why don't you guys all take a shot at what you think the correct answer is to this particular question. I'm waiting for a few more responses. I got one, but there's many more people out there than just one person. Anybody? Going once? Got a few more? Okay, you're all correct. The answer is indeed B. Okay, so the answer is B, because we know that contextually the word commissioned is certainly more of an art word, right? Let's see, what else? Licensed original paintings, language-wise, that doesn't really make sense. And forced definitely is not within the context of that particular sentence. Okay, thank you. So the answer is B. Here's another opportunity, a sample item. And one of the reasons that I chose this is it had more text. One thing I want to emphasize to everyone on the webinar is that when you go into SAT assessment items, you become painfully aware of how complex the text gets. And it's really important that in our content area classes, science, social studies, technology, health, that we give students the opportunity to work with that very complex text so they know how to manage it or can begin to manage it on an assessment such as the SAT, but also in their lives as they move into college and careers. All right, so let's look at this one, transforming the American West through food and hospitality. So why don't we do this again? You tell me, take a shot at the right answer from the SAT. I'll let you read the text and decide on your answer. Okay, what do you think? No change, B, surly, C, abysmal, or D, icky? I'm inviting you to, I got a couple of responses. And indeed, the answer is C, abysmal. Okay. All right, and now I'm going to look at something, example from the reading test. These questions in the reading test, some of them ask the student about the author's choice of words and phrases and the function of those words and phrases to shape the tone and style and meaning of the text. So I'm going to show you another example. And this is a really good example of the types of text that kids are faced with on their SAT. So I'm going to help you answer this question when you're done. I'm going to give you a second to just read the text. And when you're done, feel free to just write in what you think the answer to this question is in the questions box. Okay, I'm going to show you the answer. And the answer is C. Okay, so words such as can, may, and could in the third paragraph help establish the tone of a tentative tone, right? The authors suspect but do not know that their hypothesis is correct. Okay, so this is what your kids are up against. And this is just talking more about, this is a question around different meanings of words as they are used in a passage. And for those of you that are not familiar or need some clarification, they take a word such as intense here, right? So this is another item. The coming decades will likely see more intense clustering of jobs, innovation, and productivity in a smaller number of bigger cities and city regions. Some regions could end up bloated beyond the capacity of their infrastructure, while others struggle, their promise stymied by inadequate human or other resources. And so the word intense, this is a great example of a word that our students know, but that has many meanings depending on the passage. And so getting students used to thinking about multiple meanings or contextualized meanings for words is a very, very useful activity in your content area classes. And so the answer, not obviously, but for me, obviously, because I made the PowerPoint, the answer is concentrated, right? And concentrated clustering of jobs, innovation, and productivity. Okay. So really what this means for all teachers, for all content area teachers is that, and this is the hope in K through 12, particularly 6 through 12, is that your content is really a vehicle for helping students become linguistically successful and fluent and skilled, right? And that we need to use our instruction and our content to get students in the habit of managing complex texts, analyzing and presenting and writing to demonstrate their learning, and obviously, to help them make sense of texts, because that really is the enduring universal skill that we want all of our students to leave high school with, along with the content knowledge that they acquire. But when it comes down to it, I mean, my feeling is, and granted I have a bias because I am an adolescent literacy specialist, but there are many students that will go through chemistry and go through physics or go through AP history, and many of them, some of them, right, will not use that content knowledge on a day-to-day basis, but what they will all use is the capacity to understand and use language effectively. So it is my hope that all content area teachers embrace that. Okay, so let's talk about instructional strategies. One instructional strategy which came along with the Common Core in 2010 was this shift to close reading, right? And so close reading meaning in our classrooms, we present students with complex text and we take them through a close reading process of that text. So if you look at the indicators here, right, we are encouraging students on the left-hand side, the purple box, to build knowledge through content-rich fiction. And what this means is, in addition to every now and then delivering your presentations to students, it is very important that you actually give them text and support them in acquiring information from the text. It doesn't have to be completely unaided, right? Your support comes from the type of text that you choose, the pre-teaching that you do, the focused questions that you give them, the structured collaborative supports that you establish for them with their peers. That's what enables them to begin to access the complex text that you hopefully are introducing to them. The second, darker purple, regular practice with complex text, right? So we have that, and it's academic language. And then reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from text. And we're not going to focus too much on that today, but it is my hope certainly that those are activities that are happening in your content area classes. So to talk a little bit about close reading and analytical reading. If you think about, when you're reading for pleasure, and maybe you're reading a mystery novel, and it's something that you chose, and oftentimes our pleasure reading isn't close analytical reading, right? We choose it because it's leisurely, and most of the vocabulary is easily understandable, and narrative text structure is generally more accessible, so it doesn't require as close reading. But close reading requires us to engage and break down words, break down phrases, break down language structures, text structures, and reread and read again, and really do a thorough analysis of the text that we are managing. And so oftentimes, complex text is not text that's easily accessible to our students. And we need to guide them through that process. When we talk about academic language, right, we talk about language that's not everyday language. It's oftentimes not necessarily frequently spoken language. The language is more precise, the structures are more complex, the pronoun references are more complex, and the connectors, and the general overall structure is different than what we might read in a book for leisure. And generally, it's the level of formality in the language is greater. So this is an example of a piece of complex text that gives you something to hold on to and to take your kids through and to help them through and to give them practice with managing complex text. So when we think about what makes this an example of complex text, I'm going to stop talking for a second and I'm going to let you read it first of all. So this is the same text, and I have highlighted some of the language that seems complex. I mean, really what comes to my mind is that it is, it could come to your mind that it's unnecessarily convoluted, okay? And I could see it coming to some people's minds that it's unnecessarily convoluted. However, this is the kind of text that is going to give us something to work with, and it's also excellent practice for students and for people in their working environments when they're dealing with technical manuals, with a lot of vocabulary that they're unfamiliar with structure, with text structure that's more complicated. So let's look at this. That large animals require a luxuriant vegetation has been a general assumption which has passed from one work to another, but I do not hesitate to say, right? So again, to stop and break this language down with your students is very important, because when they face something like this, okay, they are, well, first of all, so there's the issue of giving them practice simply for endurance reasons, right? We want to get our kids used to trying and used to working through text. So the more times we can do this in our classrooms, the better. The key to using this kind of complex text in your classrooms is to make it short. So if you give students, you don't want to have, you don't want to introduce sort of your foundational content for kids. You don't want to introduce your foundational content with text that's going to challenge them, right? You want to, if you're introducing concepts at the base level, then you would like, you know, it's the ideal is you're going to use more accessible text to get foundational information across. And then as you move through your unit, right, you can bring in short, complex texts that you then can go through the exercise of deconstructing with your students. So that is the suggestion of use with complex text. So if you are a science teacher, let's say, you know, the foundational elements of your unit, let's say in photosynthesis, you know, you might want to use a PowerPoint. You might want to use, I mean, I've used children's books with high school students and with middle school students to get across foundational concepts. But interwoven into your unit, it's a very good idea to choose a couple of complex texts that you're going to work on with students and focus on the vocabulary, focus on the structure, focus on the phrases, and help kids unpack the structure and the language. So when we think about informal language and academic language, informal language relies, it's basic discourse, such as narrative, The vocabulary that's used is more what kids are accustomed to and what we're accustomed to in terms of listening and speaking, and there's heavy contextualization. The concepts are familiar, as is the vocabulary, and personal pronouns are abundant, and transition words are simple, and there's not a lot of varied word choice, right? So you're basically getting the message across, whereas with academic language, the function is more specific, so it's not necessarily narrative. It might be persuasive, it might be hypothetical, it could be argument, it could be purporting, it could be, as I said earlier, technical writing. There's more extensive use of reading and writing and for words that are not found in oral vocabulary, and it's fairly decontextualized. In other words, the kids might be going in not having a great deal of foundational knowledge. So just to give you some resources, there is an emphasis on using what we call text sets when possible, even in content area teaching. So bringing in first personal fictional narrative, primary documents, and nonfiction articles in science, in social studies, in health, in technological subjects. And down at the bottom here, there's 3 different sources for you to find complex text that relates to your subject areas. Okay, so Common Lit is terrific. Newsela is great. You can adjust the reading levels and the lexile levels to accommodate students at different access places. You know, if you have a student in 9th grade that's reading on an 8th grade level or a 7th grade level, then you can adjust what we call the lexile or the text complexity. Okay. So I encourage you to go to those sources. Thinking about, you know, if I'm a classroom teacher and I am a science or a social studies teacher, you know, the process of deciding what makes text complex, I'm going to give you some tools here to help you with that. In the upper left-hand corner of this, so I just want to, before I go into this particular document, I do want to encourage you to go to Achieve the Core. They have done a lot of work around text complexity. They even have a tool that you can paste in and it'll tell you what words are tier 2 and tier 3 words. Although just to have a disclaimer, I did experiment with it and you have to use it sort of discerningly. So if you're experienced in that, then I definitely think it's a useful tool. But if you are new to this process, I would maybe stay away from it and use some of the qualitative criteria for deciding whether text is complex and how complex. In the upper left corner where you have quantitative measure, you see www.lexile.com. And if you have a piece of text, let's say I am a science teacher and I have found a piece of text from the National Science Foundation and I want to use a scenario, I can actually copy and paste that text into lexile.com and it will tell me the lexile range of that particular text. And underneath there, you can see that there's a chart for what lexile ranges are appropriate for different grade bands. So if you look at the 6 to 8 band, 925 to 1185 is the lexile band for 6 through 8. Whoops, sorry. And then you see 1050 to 1335 and for 9 and 10, and then 11 through college and career. You have up through 1385 lexile. So that is something that you can do. I'm going to show you in the next couple slides some rubrics and tools to think about the qualitative features of text complexity. And this is a little organizer for you to think about that, thinking about the meaning and the purpose of the text, the overall structure. You know, is it narrative? Is it argumentative? Is it a technical text? Is it directive at how to? So the language and then the knowledge demands. What do students need to know as they go into work with this text? Okay. So this is a rubric that you can find in Achieve the Core. It's a rubric that helps you to think about whether your informational text that you're going to use with students is high complexity to low complexity. Right? So if we look over here under high for the purpose, right, that the purpose is implied would make it high, or the purpose of the text is difficult to determine, whereas for a lower complexity text, right, the purpose of the text is explicitly stated in the text. And then if we look at structure, the next indicator, if you look over at the high area, the organization of the text is going to be complicated. The connection between ideas is only implicit, it's not explicit. Text features may or may not be used. The use of graphics, if used. The interpretation of the graphics is essential to understanding the text, and then also might provide information not conveyed. And then if you go over to, on the right-hand side, to the lower text complexity, sorry. Again, the organization is explicit, the connection between ideas are more explicit, and it conforms more to whatever genre that it comes from. And text features help the reader understand and navigate. So like textbooks are fairly low in text complexity often because they have headers and they have organizers that help a reader understand what the focus of the text is. But in contrast to that, they also often use graphics that can be complicated. So in a low or not. Okay, so when you think about your textbooks, think about the text features and how they help to organize, and whether the use of graphics, whether they're simple and convey information that's already conveyed with words in the text or not. And then, you know, there's the next indicator is the language. What kind of language are there a lot of high frequency words? Is there a lot of oral language in the text versus you know, more academic language in the text? Is the language abstract? Is there irony? Is there figurative language that's hard to figure out? And obviously, the texts of low complexity are going to have more conversational language. Is the language dense, right? Or is it clear and explicit and literal? So these just give you some ways to think about the text complexity of your selections for your class. This is an organizer that takes those variables and allows you to put them on a continuum, right? So on the left-hand side, and feel free to take this, I will, on our site, I'll upload some more resources for you. I'm not sure that this particularly is uploaded to the webinar because we can only upload 5. So if you look on the category on the left-hand side, it goes from structure to language clarity, knowledge. So what are the knowledge demands of the student? You know, how much background knowledge does a student need to have? What are the cultural aspects that a student may need to understand in order to access a piece of text? What are the different levels? Are there multiple meanings represented in the text, or is it fairly straightforward? Is the purpose of the text explicit, right? So you can sort of go through your text and make that decision. This is that organizer filled in. I don't know how many of you read the Longitude Prize, but it's a text you might use in social studies, and it's from Appendix B, I think, in the Common Core, and they list some complex text. So if you're having questions about what would constitute a complex text in your discipline area, if you Google the Common Core standards, and in the Appendix B, they have lists, beautiful long lists that are organized by grade bands in the different content areas that show you what would be considered good, solid, challenging texts in your discipline. So even if you're not going to use some of those texts in your actual instruction, I think it's very good to go and look at those texts in the Common Core Appendix B. And the Longitude Prize is one of those texts from the Common Core. So you can see here how this example sort of, there's, the person wrote sort of a paragraph for their notes on each of those indicators and placed the text ultimately at out of the band, I guess. It said not suited to band. So I'm suspecting that beginning to middle of 10th grade band. So it's not 9th grade, but the 10th grade band, I guess. Okay. So you want to think about that, what the grade level band might be. So let's move now into vocabulary and what we can think about when we look at complex text and how to help our kids with vocabulary. The way that we talk about vocabulary, you can talk about it any way you want, but the way literacy folks talk about vocabulary, and I hope this will make sense for you, is tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 words, right? So, and this will make sense, it's not rocket science, right? Tier 1 words is your everyday speech. It's the speech that you use in your writing, informally, you hear the words, you obviously use these words in your oral language, and that words that would not be considered a challenge to your average native speaker. It's important, of course, to think about whether the kids in your class are native speakers or not. So that's important to consider. Your tier 2 words are your general academic words, and I'm going to introduce you to something called the academic word list in a little bit, and I'll talk about that. I'm a big fan. Tier 2 words are more likely to appear in written text than in speech, and it's language that appears across the board, across disciplines, in informational text, technical text, and literary texts. And they're general words, but they're a tier sort of more challenging than your everyday speech. And then we have our tier 3 words, which are domain specific, which will be different in science, it will be different in social studies, it will be different in health, right? But these are the words that are key to understanding the concepts that you are teaching in your classrooms. So one thing that is important when we're trying to help kids with vocabulary acquisition and to grow their language use is pre-teaching vocabulary, right? Or if not pre-teaching it, then at least drawing students' attention to troubling vocabulary before they start to work through a text. So when we choose words to focus on, we're going to ask ourselves, what are the words in this text that are most critical to understanding it? What are the words that students will encounter again? What are the words that will be most useful in their writing? And what are the words that can be used in a variety of ways in different texts and that connect to other texts and other words and other concepts? And help students to be more specific to have a more specific understanding of the concepts that they are building on. This is an example of a vocabulary analysis sheet. So this is a tool that I have used when I was planning instruction, and then I have helped content area teachers use when they were planning instruction. The words themselves in this, I left them in the example so you could see the types of words, but obviously you don't have the context of the words. So yeah, you'll have to take my word for it. On the left-hand side, you can see the 2 quadrants. The meaning can be determined from the context. So This up here in the upper half of the organizer, you will have previewed the text that you are going to give your students. You will pull out those unfamiliar words from the text that students will be able to discern if you teach them how to use the context. Okay? Now, left and right, the ones on the left of those words in the upper half of the organizer, right, the words on the left, carcass, suburbia, and nonchalance, they merit less time and attention because the teacher that created this, filled out this organizer and was giving the text to his or her students, decided that those are not generalizable words. They're not as high frequency. Students may not see them in other texts as frequently as words such as dismantled or the word supposition. Now, I agree with that. I hope you agree with that. If you don't, then certainly write in a question. Underneath, you can see meaning needs to be provided. So those are words that the instructor of this particular class that's introducing this text to his or her students, they've decided, you know what, we can't tell the meaning of these words, terra firma and lap of lichen, from the context. So I am going to have to pre-teach or provide that meaning. And then if we look to the right, we see words that merit more time and attention because, again, those 4 words certainly are words that students might see in another context. So I hope that this organizer helps you to make sense of what words need to be taught and what words kids can find within the context, and help you to prepare if you're going to bring in a piece of text for your students and introduce them to it, to do this pre-planning so that you know exactly how to support them as they work through a piece of complex text. Another way to help students work through complex text and figure out vocabulary and use vocabulary effectively in the text that they read and write is to create text-dependent questions, which again requires you to take the piece of text that you're introducing to your students and to read the text closely before them, okay, and then identify the content and ideas and the vocabulary and language structures that are going to be difficult for them. And then you're going to formulate questions that will guide them through the text that they can work on independently, but that they can also work on collaboratively, which I'm a huge advocate. Those of you that know me, especially if you're here from Pinkerton, and I see a couple, big into collaborative structures for breaking down and deconstructing texts together. You're going to start with easy questions, and you're going to get more complex as you go. But the important steps that I want you to think about here are steps 1 through 4, right? So you go through the material, identify the content and ideas, identify the vocabulary, and what is going to pose a problem for them, and then give them a few questions that will take them through the text, that if they can answer those questions, you know that they will come out the other side with an understanding of that text. That makes them go back to the text and cite the evidence from the text that they base their answer on. Going back to academic vocabulary for a second, this was just to reinforce the difference between Tier 2 and Tier 3 vocabulary, in case you didn't get it the first time. Again, Tier 2 is not unique to the discipline. Tier 3 is. Tier 2 goes across disciplines, and Tier 3 vocabulary is going to be different in different disciplines. Okay, and I'm going to skip that because that again talks about text-dependent questions. Oh, I have some repetitive. So this is a just a fact, right, that we want to keep in mind. Children and adults need to see and hear a word in meaningful context 10 to 15 times before they know it. So as a classroom teacher and as a disciplinary teacher, what I would suggest to you is to use something like a word wall, for example. So when you have a unit that you're focusing on, as kids acquire new vocabulary through the course of the unit, I would stick it on your wall and it becomes a word wall, and label it as a word wall. And then as you move through the unit, stop and, quiz kids orally, have them create activities around the word wall, take the words from that word wall, and I'm going to go more into this in a second when I talk about different strategies to use in the classroom. But I want you to keep in mind that in order for kids to internalize the vocabulary that you are introducing to them, they need to hear it and use it in context 10 to 15 times. And that's really the important takeaway here. This just gives you some student prompts, right? So when you are working in close reading to try to get kids to really push themselves, these are some questions to ask. What makes you say that? How do you know? Where in the text did you find that? Can you tell me more? And what do you think? Why do you think that? My favorite is why do you think that, without a doubt. Okay, so we're going to spend the last part of the webinar talking about some classroom strategies for vocabulary in particular. Here's one that's super easy. I've used this in groups and individually. So what I've done in the past is I've introduced a bunch of vocabulary words that have to do with a specific unit of study. And the kids can go across and use the rating checklist to identify their familiarity with the words. There's a second one here. This is a different version of it that shows you, it's just, there's more categorization in this one. There's another column that you can also include that says, like, basically I could teach it to another student. And what I've done is I've had students do this individually, and then I've had them come together as a small group of, 4 kids, let's say, with their list and work together to get themselves to a point where everybody in the group knows the meaning of all the words, right? So it's a cooperative learning activity, right, where they then become teachers of each other and they become the experts in the words that they know. And then the culminating activity might be some sort of game or activity where everyone needs to know, maybe you could go out and have a jigsaw, and everyone is then obligated to know all of the word meanings and pass that information on. So there's one. I love word sorts, right? So you give kids a bunch of words. This is Robert Marzano, who is supporting the use of word sorts here. Similarities, differences in classifying information yields high gains in learning. Again, you're helping students learn vocabulary by comparing and contrasting and classifying words. They're recognizing their own relationships with words and the relationships between words and terms that are related to the same concept. You're helping with their reasoning and their analysis, their divergent thinking when open sorts are used, and their convergent thinking when closed sorts are used. And they're in control, right? It's a student-driven activity. So just to show you what that might look like, you could give kids unit-related words on cards or copy words into sticky notes and then pair them or group them. And there's 2 different ways to do this. You can have the teacher provide categories, and that would be a closed sort, and then the kids take the words and organize them into the categories that the teacher provides. Or you can let the students take all of the words and sort them into the categories that make sense to the students and then label them. I, obviously, because of who I am, I prefer open sort. I like constructive thinking. And then you can have the students provide evidence and argue for why they sorted the vocabulary in a particular way, which I used very much. And, and then you can have them discuss and write about the concept using the words in the word sort. So this is just a closed word sort. There's a word bank at the top. And you can see here, this is an example, language that describes an estuary, an ocean, and a stream. And then they would place the words in the appropriate column, and then they would write the evidence in the box next to it. Okay. This is some words from a geography word sort, that you might use. Next, using analytical graphic organizers. I'm sure that many of you have used organizers as a way of learning. They're very effective for note-taking, for showing relationships. If you go down to the third bullet, cause and effect, sequence, helping kids to organize information and compare information from different sources. Completed collaboratively is always preferable. Often preferable. So this is a vocabulary graphic organizer called a Frayer model. And if you have a concept such as stars, right, to help kids understand the concept better, they are asked to generate examples of the concept and then non-examples and provide a definition in the bottom right corner and describe the characteristics of that particular concept. So this is a really easy way to help kids to construct meaning around a given word or concept. It's called a Frayer model. This is a great one. It's a semantic gradience organizer, and students have to, in this particular one, you can provide the words along the gradient, but I chose this one because it's not provided, and I like that. It really makes kids think. I'm a literary person, and I like to think about the specificity and the sort of fine connotations of words. So we have on the left, Hamon's team blanked their opponents 45-3, right? So you might start at the left-hand side and say something like beat, and then kids would, at each of those lines, right, a student might, or a group of students, it certainly would be more fun in a small group or in a pair, come up with words that were increasingly more precise and work their way towards obliterated or decimated, right? So it's a really fun way to get kids to think about precision of words. All right, here's the academic word list. Something that I've recommended to lots and lots of middle and high school middle schools and high schools has been that they choose words from this academic word list. This woman, Avril Coxhead, she's in Canada, I think. Yeah, she's in Canada. You can Google her. She has come up with the high incident academic word list, and it's like the top 1,000 words that are most frequently used in academic texts. So if you look at the words in front of you, you can see that these are certainly tier 2 words. These are all words that are used across disciplines in texts that you would find in school cross disciplines and also in the workplace, in newspapers and magazines and periodicals, and everywhere that students and adults would need to acquire information. So my recommendation is that as a grade level team or as a discipline area team, but I think maybe as a grade level I like it best, choose 5 to 10 academic words you know, a month maybe, or, you know, 25 words a semester. And, you know, maybe the 9th grade is focusing on these 10 words for these 2 weeks. And you're going to make it a point to bring out, you know, you look at your curriculum, look at your units, look at what you're focusing on. And, you know, even just to post these words on a word wall and try to bring them into your instruction across disciplines so that students go from class to class to class and they see the same vocabulary, which increases their exposure. Okay, so that's the academic word list. And this is, whoops, a little typo up there, concept mapping. This is another strategy I'm really big on. This is super fun for kids, and you can do it in a lot of different ways. There's technology that allows this to happen very easily. For example, Inspiration software. I'm trying to look. Inspiration software allows teachers to do this. It's basically mind mapping software. Another thing I've seen done is students sit together in a circle and they all have different words on cards, and then they have connector phrases on sentence strips with arrows at the end. And as a group, like maybe, you know, it could be anywhere from 4 to, I'd probably keep it up to 8 kids. They sit around a circle and they can physically construct a concept map with the vocabulary that they have collectively, and then create a collaborative argument for why they organized their concept map the way that they did. So you can do this as a pre-instructional activity. I've seen it used best as a post-instructional activity, almost as a formative assessment activity. So concept mapping is a great thing to use. And then last, I'm just gonna, there's a lot of folks on the webinar from Pinkerton, and I wanna just reinforce the idea that reciprocal teaching is certainly a setting where students can work with vocabulary and where they can work through complex texts together. I'm not gonna go into depth on this. For those of you that wanna know more about reciprocal teaching, certainly send me an email. I'm happy to come in and work with you around that. I have a recorded webinar on reciprocal teaching that is on our Performance Plus resource site. It's an interactive, I'll talk a little bit about it. It's an interactive process where you break students up into teams of 4, and you give them a piece of complex text, and every student has a role that they have to leverage to work through that text together. And some of the roles, there's a student that is the summarizer, who facilitates the students in the group to summarize, then also offers his or her own summary, guided by the questions that you can see there, right? And then the questioner, that's another role. Students are encouraged to ask questions about text. I wonder why the author said this. I wonder why the author used this particular word. I wonder why the author, you know, didn't say it this way. The clarifier is really the key to working through vocabulary, right? The clarifier's job might be to find words in the text or phrases in the text that are confusing, and facilitate the process of the kids figuring out the meanings together, either by looking them up or using context clues. And then the predictor, which I'm not going to go into right now. And there's a facilitator, okay? We love reciprocal teaching. It's cooperative. It's research supported. It's free. It's for all disciplines. And it helps students to construct meaning on their own, which is very empowering in middle school and high school. So I'm not going to do the poll, but thank you for attending the webinar. I am going to stay on and see if you guys have any questions for a second or two. Indy, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I don't see that there are any questions. So if you, India, what time is it?
My time says it's 3:22, so I
Oh, I went over.
assume
4:20.
I'm,
So yeah, you're in
yeah,
another state.
yes,
All right. So,
I'm central.
so I just went over for a couple of minutes, and I hope that all of you enjoyed the webinar. Please get in touch with me if you would like to go into any of these further, and I can help you out if you want to do some planning with any of the strategies that we talked about today. So take care, and I look forward to hopefully hearing from some of you soon. Bye, India.
Bye, everyone.